They fired me for restructuring, then paid me to fix what they broke. I never thought I'd share this, but the morning I was escorted out of my own office, I remember noticing how aggressively cheerful the lobby smelled, like citrus cleaner and burned coffee, as if the building itself was trying to convince me nothing was wrong. 2 security guards walked on either side of me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat of their bodies through my blazer. And I kept thinking how absurd it was that 3 years of my life had been reduced to this quiet, humiliating parade past people who pretended to be deeply invested in their emails. No one looked up. Not my manager, not the HR rep who'd smiled at me in the hallway every morning, not the woman who used to borrow my phone charger twice a week and swear she'd buy her own. 30 minutes earlier, I'd been called into a conference room and told my role was being eliminated due to restructuring, which is corporate for we've already decided and nothing you say will matter. And when I asked why my projects were still active in the system, the HR director just blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I wasn't angry yet. Just hollow, like someone had scooped something essential out of my chest and left the rest intact enough to keep functioning. I packed my desk while a guard stared at the wall, hands folded, as if this was awkward for him too. And I remember slipping my notebook into my bag, the one with the handwritten workflows and vendor contacts that lived only in my head and those pages. When we reached the exit, the badge reader chirped as my access was revoked, a sharp final sound, and the guard said, "Good luck," in a voice that sounded more like an apology. Outside, my phone buzzed with a Slack notification I could no longer open, and that's when it hit me. They thought I was disposable, interchangeable, a problem already solved. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, hands shaking just enough to scare me, because somewhere beneath the shock, something colder was forming, something patient, and I didn't know it yet. But this was the beginning of the part where everything changed. This happened a few years ago, but I still think about how quiet my apartment felt that afternoon, like it was holding its breath with me as I dropped my bag by the door and sat on the floor because the couch suddenly felt too far away. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, the way my director wouldn't meet my eyes, the way HR used words like alignment and strategic shift, as if that softened the fact that they'd been planning my exit for months. What hurt most wasn't the layoff itself. It was the realization that everything I'd warned them about, every risk memo, every late-night fix I'd quietly pushed through to keep things running, had been ignored because it was easier to believe I'd always be there. I opened my laptop out of habit, then laughed when I remembered my credentials were already dead, my digital footprint erased in under an hour, like I'd never existed. Emails I'd sent at midnight, weekend messages reassuring executives during outages, all of it now sealed behind a login I no longer had. I poured a glass of wine even though it was barely 3, then didn't drink it, just stared at it while my phone lit up with texts from coworkers asking if the rumors were true, followed by radio silence when I confirmed them. That was when the fear finally arrived, heavy and physical, the kind that presses on your lungs and makes you do math you didn't plan on doing, rent minus savings minus pride. I told myself I'd take a day to grieve, to feel sorry for myself, but instead I found my notebook again, flipping through pages filled with processes no one else understood, client preferences never documented, shortcuts built on experience rather than policy. It wasn't proprietary sabotage material, nothing illegal or malicious, just the connective tissue that made the machine work smoothly, the human layer they'd decided was unnecessary. I thought about the replacement job posting I'd seen weeks earlier, dressed up as future growth, and the way my manager had laughed when I asked if I should be worried. Sitting there on my living room floor, I finally admitted something I'd avoided for years. They hadn't fired me because I failed. They fired me because they thought they'd extracted everything they needed from me. The irony was almost funny. Almost. I closed the notebook and set it aside, not with anger, but with a strange sense of calm, because for the first time since I'd been escorted out, I understood exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. I woke up the next morning to the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, the mental hangover of realizing your stability was conditional all along, and for a few minutes I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how many times I'd ignored that truth because it was inconvenient. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder that made me snort out loud, quarterly risk review prep, something I'd set months ago and built entirely on my own, and I imagined the meeting happening without me. The awkward pauses where I used to speak, the way my absence would be explained with vague professionalism. I made coffee, too strong, and opened LinkedIn, which felt like emotional self-harm, only to see my company had already posted a smiling update about exciting organizational changes, complete with stock photos of diverse people laughing around a laptop. That's when the anger finally found me, sharp and clean, not explosive but clarifying, like finally putting on glasses after squinting for years. I started getting calls around noon, first from a junior analyst whispering that my dashboard wasn't loading properly, then from someone in ops asking if I'd ever written down how to handle a specific vendor escalation. And I listened politely, telling them I no longer had access and suggesting they check the shared drive. Each call ended the same way, with an uncomfortable silence and a mumbled apology, as if they were realizing in real time that removing me hadn't removed the need for me. I didn't offer help, not out of spite, but because I genuinely couldn't without crossing lines that protected me now, and because part of me needed them to sit with the consequences of their decisions. By late afternoon, my former manager finally called, his voice overly casual, asking how I was holding up and whether I might be open to a short-term consulting arrangement to help transition things smoothly. I laughed then, not kindly, and told him I'd need time to think, watching his confidence flicker through the phone. After we hung up, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. I wasn't panicking. I was evaluating, calculating, finally seeing the full picture from outside the frame they'd kept me trapped in. They thought they'd closed a chapter by letting me go, but all they'd really done was give me back control of the narrative. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something dangerously close to empowered. By the third day, the shock had worn off enough for patterns to emerge. And once you see patterns, you can't unsee them. My inbox, now personal instead of corporate, filled with LinkedIn messages from recruiters who'd ignored me for years, suddenly impressed by my availability, while my phone lit up with increasingly frantic texts from people still inside the building. One asked if I remembered the exact logic behind a compliance exception I'd approved last quarter, another wanted to know why a report kept flagging false positives now that I wasn't tuning it, and a third just sent, "Are you okay?" followed by nothing when I replied yes. I started to realize how much unpaid emotional labor I'd been doing too, smoothing tensions, translating executive panic into actionable steps, quietly absorbing blame when things went wrong so others could look decisive. That labor vanished the moment I did. I took a long walk that afternoon, the kind you don't schedule but desperately need, and noticed how different the world felt when my phone wasn't a ticking time bomb. No Slack pings, no emergency emails, no guilt for not responding fast enough. Somewhere between the grocery store and my apartment, it hit me that I'd been operating in survival mode for so long, I'd mistaken it for ambition. When my former manager called again that evening, this time more direct, asking if I could just hop on a quick call to explain a system dependency no one could trace, I said no without apologizing. The silence on the line was almost satisfying. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open, not to give anything away, but to really look at what I'd built over the years, the scope of it, the depth, the parts no org chart could capture. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet to be seen as easy to work with, all the times I'd accepted praise instead of pay, stability instead of growth. That night, I updated my resume for the first time in years, not out of desperation, but clarity. And as I typed, I realized this wasn't the aftermath of being fired. This was the uncomfortable, exhilarating beginning of finally being honest about my value. The first time I heard the phrase knowledge transfer after I'd been fired, it came in an email from HR that was so politely worded it made my teeth ache, like they were offering me a gift instead of asking me to mop up their mess. They wanted a 1-hour transition call to ensure continuity, and they attached a calendar invite with a Zoom link like I still belonged to their ecosystem, like my time was still theirs to schedule. I stared at it for a long minute, then forwarded it to my personal email again just so I could watch the corporate signature block bounce back like a rubber stamp of audacity. They weren't asking because they respected me. They were asking because something was already breaking, and they needed a familiar hand to shove the pieces back into place before anyone important noticed. I replied with one sentence: "Happy to support as an independent consultant. Please send a contract and scope." 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my former director, voice strained, trying to sound warm. "We really just need a quick walkthrough," he said, and I could practically hear him smiling through clenched teeth. The same man who'd sat silently while HR read my termination script. I told him I understood, and that my consulting rate was $400 an hour with a 4-hour minimum, billed up front, because that's what urgency costs when you're not paying someone to prevent it. He made a choking sound like he'd swallowed a Lego. "That's higher than we expected," he said, and I almost laughed, because of course it was. They'd expected me to be grateful for crumbs again, to be the same compliant version of myself who solved problems quietly and accepted whatever she was handed. I let the silence stretch until it got uncomfortable, then said, "I'm available today until 5. He tried one more time, something about teamwork and doing the right thing, and I felt that old reflex to soften, to make it easier for him, rise in me like muscle memory. I pushed it down. Doing the right thing would have been staffing my team and listening when I warned you. I said, calm as a glass of water. This is doing business. 15 minutes later, an email arrived from procurement with a contract labeled Emergency Services Agreement, and when I opened it, my hands were steady, because for the first time in my career, the power wasn't in their building. It was sitting at my kitchen table, in sweatpants, deciding what my expertise was worth. The contract hit my inbox with the kind of speed that only happens when executives can smell consequences, and I read it twice before signing because I'd learned the hard way that desperation makes people sloppy, and sloppiness becomes your problem if you're not careful. They paid the invoice within the hour, which told me everything I needed to know about how budget constraints had always been selective. And at 3 p.m., I clicked into the Zoom call from my kitchen, hair in a messy bun, notebook at my elbow like a quiet flex. My former director was there, along with HR, 2 IT guys I'd never seen before, and a woman in a crisp blazer who introduced herself as interim lead, which was corporate for we promoted someone too fast, and now we're pretending it's intentional. No one apologized. They just launched into a frantic explanation about a workflow that had suddenly stopped working, as if software has moods, as if systems fail out of spite. I asked one question, what changed? Silence. Then the interim lead cleared her throat and admitted they'd streamlined my approval chain to speed things up, which meant they'd remove the checks I'd built to keep certain filings compliant, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what that would trigger. I didn't scold. I just asked them to share their screen, and within 5 minutes I found the culprit. A single toggle flipped to the wrong setting, the kind of thing you only touch if you don't understand why it exists. The IT guy started to say, "That shouldn't matter," and I cut him off gently with, "It matters because regulators don't care about your intentions. They care about your audit trail." HR's face tightened at the word regulators, like I'd said a curse word in a church. I walked them through reversing the change, then asked to see the error log that followed the streamlining. When the list loaded, it just kept scrolling, dozens of flagged exceptions, time-stamped, unreviewed, sitting there like unattended candles. My former director tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably noise, but the interim lead's eyes went wide because she understood, finally, what I'd been shielding them from. I muted myself for a second, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I didn't trust the smile pulling at my mouth. Then I unmuted and said, very calmly, "You don't have a workflow problem. You have an exposure problem, and it started the moment you decided my job was optional." They wanted me to fix it quickly, like it was a printer jam, but what I was looking at on that shared screen was more like a sinkhole that had been forming under their feet for months while they kept laying pretty pavement over it. The error log wasn't just messy, it was specific, the kind of specific that makes auditors lean back in their chair and start asking for names. I asked who'd approved the streamlined change, and my former director immediately said, "It was a collaborative decision, which is the corporate equivalent of a child saying the dog ate it." The interim lead's voice went small when she admitted she'd clicked the toggle because she'd been told my process was too cautious and the team needed to move faster, and I could see it on her face, that dawning realization that speed is only impressive until it turns into damage. I kept my tone neutral because I wasn't there to punish anyone. I was there to define the reality they were now stuck inside. "Okay," I said, "we need to triage," and I watched them all lean in like I'd just given them oxygen. I built a plan in real time. Stop the automated filings, pull the last 30 days of submissions, isolate the ones with missing approval stamps, and assign actual humans to review them, not whatever half-documented process they'd replaced me with. Someone asked, hopefully, if we could just rerun the workflow and backfill the approvals, and I stared at them, waiting for them to hear how that sounded. "If you backdate approvals after the fact," I said carefully, "you're not fixing an error, you're creating a falsification trail." HR swallowed hard, and my former director rubbed his forehead like I was being dramatic, but no one argued. Then the interim lead asked the question I knew was coming, the one everyone avoids until avoidance becomes impossible. "If regulators ask why this happened, what do we say?" I paused, because this was the moment where the old version of me would have offered them a soft landing, a story that protected leadership at my own expense. Instead, I said the truth in a voice so calm it felt surgical. "You say you remove the controls without understanding them, and you say you're bringing in external expertise to remediate." External expertise. Me, in other words, but framed in a way that made it sound like a proactive choice instead of a scrambling necessity. My director tried to steer it back toward quick fixes, but then an IT guy's phone started buzzing and he went pale, muttering, "The client portal is timing out." And I felt that cold clarity settle again, because I could see the dominoes tipping in the exact order I'd warned them about in meeting after meeting. "This isn't just compliance," I said quietly. "It's the system. It's all connected. And you pulled the wrong thread." The next 48 hours felt like watching a slow-motion car crash while standing safely on the sidewalk, except the people inside kept calling me to ask if I could just run into traffic and steer for them. I got another paid block approved, and suddenly I was in back-to-back Zooms with teams that had never learned my name when I worked there, but now spoke it like a spell, like saying it might reverse what they'd set in motion. The client portal outages weren't random. They were downstream from the same streamlining that had removed throttles and checks, and now their servers were treating legitimate user activity like a flood. The interim lead kept trying to patch symptoms, restart services, bump limits, throw more compute at it, while I kept dragging the conversation back to root cause because you can't outspend bad architecture forever, and every Band-Aid was just another future failure with a timestamp. By day 2, the most important client, the one my director used to name drop like a personality trait, had escalated to the account VP, and then to the COO, and then to a war room call where I was introduced as a former team member assisting on a transition basis, like I was a temp who'd stopped by out of kindness. I let them have the euphemism. I had the contract and the invoice, and that was the only truth that mattered. The war room was chaos disguised as productivity, dozens of people talking over each other, everyone wanting a quick answer that didn't implicate their decisions, and I watched my former director keep trying to control the narrative, blaming unexpected volume and vendor instability, until the client's CTO finally said, flat and tired, "You're describing symptoms? Who built this workflow, and why isn't that person leading remediation?" Every camera box went still. My director's face did something I'll never forget, an almost imperceptible flicker between annoyance and fear, and then he said my name like it was an afterthought. "She's on the call," he offered. The CTO looked directly at my video tile. "Then talk," she said. And in that moment, I realized the viral part of stories like this isn't the revenge fantasy, it's the clarity. The second you stop playing small to make other people comfortable, the room changes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grandstand. I just explained in plain language what had been changed, what it broke, what it exposed, and what it would take to fix it without creating new liabilities. When I finished, the CTO nodded once and said, "That's the first coherent plan we've heard all week." My director swallowed hard, because the only thing worse than being wrong is being wrong in front of someone who matters, and for the first time, I could see him realizing he couldn't charm his way out of engineering reality. After that war room call, the tone inside my old company shifted in a way that was almost physical, like the air got thinner and everyone started measuring their words. I could tell who was used to being listened to and who was used to being ignored, because the moment the client's CTO validated me, suddenly my former director stopped interrupting, HR stopped trying to steer conversations toward process improvement, and people who'd never asked my opinion before started saying, "What do you recommend?" like it had always been that way. The interim lead messaged me privately on Teams from an account she'd apparently created just for this, asking if we could talk one-on-one, and when we did, she sounded like someone trying not to cry at work, which is a sound I know too well. She admitted she'd been told I was difficult and overly controlling, that leadership framed my safeguards as ego instead of experience, and she'd believed it because she wanted to prove she belonged. I surprised myself by feeling sympathy because I remembered being her, eager, anxious, willing to accept the company's version of reality because it was easier than admitting you were being used. I told her the truth. They didn't hire you to replace me, they hired you to make it look like they could. That landed hard. Then she asked the question that had been sitting between us like an exposed wire. Is there anything else I should know? I could have listed a dozen fragile systems, every soft spot I'd been quietly monitoring, every near miss I'd caught at 2 a.m. and fixed without fanfare, but I didn't. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I was no longer their safety net. I told her what I was contractually obligated to tell her, what was relevant to the current incident, and then I said, if you want to keep this place stable, you need documentation, redundancy, and a team, not one exhausted person. She laughed bitterly and said, I asked for headcount and they told me to be scrappy. That word, scrappy, used to make me feel proud, like I was resilient. Now it sounded like a polite way of saying suffer quietly. Later that night, my former director emailed me again, asking if I'd consider coming back in some capacity once the crisis settled. And for a second, I just stared at the subject line because the audacity was almost impressive. Come back, as if I'd left voluntarily, as if they hadn't walked me out, as if I didn't remember the badge reader chirping when they cut me off. I didn't reply right away. I poured a glass of wine, actually drank it this time, and felt something settle in me, a decision forming with the kind of certainty that doesn't need drama. They could pay for my expertise, but they couldn't have my loyalty back for free. By the end of that week, my calendar looked like a consultant's fever dream, blocks of paid time carved out by a company that still couldn't quite admit they'd created the mess, only that I was now essential to containing it. I kept my boundaries tight, starting and ending calls exactly on time, redirecting scope creep with the kind of calm firmness I'd never felt allowed to use as an employee. When my former director tried to slip in a quick question after a call ended, I smiled and said, "Happy to cover that in our next session," and disconnected before he could argue. The power shift was subtle but undeniable. I was no longer managing his anxiety for free. Internally, things were unraveling faster than they could spin them. The client demanded a written remediation plan with named owners, and suddenly everyone was scrambling to put their names anywhere but near the risky parts. I watched leadership try to spread accountability so thin it almost disappeared, and for the first time, it wasn't my job to absorb it. The interim lead sent me drafts late at night asking for feedback, and I responded during business hours only, concise and professional, because martyrdom had stopped feeling noble. On Friday afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, it was the COO, his voice smooth and practiced, thanking me for stepping up and asking if I'd be open to a longer-term engagement, maybe even a return to the organization in a redefined role. I let him talk, let him frame it as a compliment, let him avoid the words fired and mistake, and when he finally paused, I said something that felt radical in its simplicity. I'm not interested in returning to an environment that undervalues preventive work. He tried to pivot, talking about culture shifts and lessons learned, but I could hear the calculation under it, the desire to stabilize without fundamentally changing. I told him I'd consider an extended consulting contract if the scope included building documentation, training a team, and actual authority to enforce controls, not just advise on them. There was a long pause, then a careful, "We'll need to discuss that internally," which was executive for we don't like losing leverage. After we hung up, I realized something else had changed too. I wasn't fantasizing about vindication anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology or a dramatic reckoning. I was building something new in the space they'd cleared, and whether they learned from this or not was no longer the measure of my worth. The decision not to go back settled into me quietly, without fireworks, and once it did, everything else got easier to see. I started turning down meetings that felt performative, the ones where leadership wanted my presence more than my expertise, and I could tell it unnerved them to realize access to me was no longer guaranteed. The extended consulting contract came through with just enough concessions to save face, but not enough to signal real change, and that told me all I needed to know. I countered anyway, outlining exactly what sustainable remediation looked like, knowing full well they'd balk, and when they did, I felt relief instead of disappointment. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Other companies started reaching out, quietly at first, referrals from people who'd been on those war room calls, people who'd seen me operate under pressure and recognized the difference between noise and competence. One message stood out, a VP from a mid-sized firm who said, "We're trying to build things right before they break," and I laughed out loud because that sentence alone told me more about their culture than any careers page ever could. While my old company continued patching and repatching, I spent my time drafting frameworks, not just technical ones, but boundaries for myself, rules about how I'd work and what I'd tolerate. No more being the invisible glue, no more being praised instead of protected. The interim lead sent me a long message one night thanking me for being honest when no one else was, and admitting she was considering leaving too. And I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Systems reflect values, and when values are misaligned, the people inside them eventually fracture. On my last official consulting call, my former director tried one final time to float the idea of coming home, framing it as unfinished business. And I told him the truth, gently but firmly. "I already finished my part. You just didn't notice until it stopped working." When I logged off, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. The kind of free that comes when you stop waiting for permission to matter and start choosing environments that don't require you to justify your existence. I closed my laptop, looked around my apartment, and for the first time since that citrus-scented walk to the exit, I wasn't replaying the past or bracing for the next crisis. I was planning forward, and it felt like reclaiming time I didn't realize had been stolen from me. The weeks after I cut ties felt strangely quiet, not empty, but spacious, like I'd finally stepped out of a crowded room and could hear my own thoughts again. I took on 2 new clients, both smaller, both refreshingly honest about what they didn't know, and the contrast to my old job was almost jarring. When I flagged risks, they listened. When I said something needed more time or more people, they didn't accuse me of being negative or difficult. They asked what it would take to do it right. It made me realize how warped my baseline had become, how I'd been conditioned to expect resistance as the default. Meanwhile, bits of news from my former company drifted back to me through mutual contacts. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but enough to paint a picture of slow, grinding consequences. The interim lead resigned. 2 senior managers quietly transferred to other divisions. The client portal stabilized, but only after they rolled back nearly every efficiency change they'd rushed through. And even then, the work moved slower without someone anticipating problems before they surfaced. I didn't feel smug about it. If anything, I felt a dull sadness for the version of myself who'd tried so hard to prevent exactly this outcome. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a call with a new client, my phone buzzed with a text from a former coworker I'd always liked, someone who'd kept their head down and their empathy intact. "I just wanted you to know," she wrote, "people finally understand what you did here. It just took losing you to see it." I stared at that message for a long time before replying with a simple heart, because there was no response that wouldn't cheapen it. Understanding that arrives too late isn't redemption. It's residue. That night, I went through my old notebook again, not with bitterness, but with curiosity, tracing the evolution of my thinking over the years, seeing how much I'd grown in spite of the environment, not because of it. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. And being done, truly done, felt like the most powerful position of all. About a month later, I ran into my former director at a coffee shop near my old office. One of those awkward collisions you can't plan for, but somehow always sense a second before they happen. He looked thinner, more tired, the confidence he used to wear like armor now frayed at the edges. And when he saw me, his face did that familiar calculation, deciding which version of himself to present. We exchanged pleasantries, the weather, the line, the price of oat milk, until he finally sighed and said, "I wish we'd handled things differently," which is the kind of sentence that wants credit for regret without actually naming harm. I nodded, because I didn't need him to understand anymore. He told me they were still dealing with fallout, audits, delayed initiatives, a client that never fully trusted them again, and for a moment, I saw him waiting, just a little, for me to reassure him, to say it would all be okay, the way I used to. I didn't. I told him I was consulting now, that I was happy, and I meant it in a way that didn't require his validation. He asked, almost sheepishly, how I'd known things would unravel the way they did, and I realized this was the real question, the one he'd never asked while I worked for him. "Because I was paying attention," I said simply, "and because I was allowed to." We finished our drinks in silence, not hostile, just final, and when we parted, I felt a surprising flicker of gratitude, not for him, but for the clarity that encounter gave me. On the walk home, I thought about how many women I know with similar stories, quietly holding systems together until the day they're told they're replaceable, and I felt a responsibility settle in me that went beyond my own career. I started mentoring a junior analyst from one of my new clients, then another, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the hard-earned lessons about boundaries, documentation, and never confusing loyalty with self-erasure. My story wasn't unique, but maybe that was the point. Maybe its power wasn't in how exceptional it was, but in how familiar it felt, and how many people saw themselves in it once it was finally told. The last time I thought about that job in any meaningful way was during a quiet Sunday morning, coffee cooling on the counter, sunlight stretching across my living room like it had nowhere else to be. I was prepping for a workshop I'd agreed to lead for a group of women in operations and compliance, all at different stages of burnout. And as I pulled slides together, I realized how much of my story had become a framework instead of a wound. I wasn't telling it to relive it anymore. I was telling it to translate it, to give language to things we're trained to endure silently. When I talked about preventive work, about invisible labor, about the danger of being the only one who knows how something works, heads nodded so hard I worried about necks. Afterward, a woman stayed behind and said, "I thought being indispensable would protect me." And I felt that old ache, familiar but no longer sharp. I told her what I wish someone had told me years earlier. Indispensability without authority is a liability, not leverage. Walking home, I passed the old office building, its glass reflecting the sky like nothing inside could ever be messy, and for the first time, I didn't feel pulled toward it or repelled by it. It was just a place I used to work. My former company eventually stabilized, or at least found a new normal they could live with, but they never called again, and that silence felt like confirmation rather than rejection. I'd outgrown the version of myself that waited to be seen, and in doing so, I'd changed the trajectory of my career in a way no promotion ever could. That night, I closed my notebook for the last time, not because the work was done, but because it had finally moved out of the shadows and into a life that felt like mine. The story wasn't about revenge or even justice, not really. It was about what happens when you stop letting people confuse your patience with permission and how quietly powerful it can be to walk away without needing the last word. The funny thing is, if you asked my old company today what went wrong, they'd probably give you a sanitized answer about timing, communication gaps, or growing pains, because it's easier to blame abstractions than admit you ignored the person trying to protect you. And if you asked me what I gained, I wouldn't say revenge or even vindication, because those feelings fade faster than you expect. What I gained was perspective, the kind that only comes when something you built your identity around disappears overnight, and you're forced to see who you are without it. I learned that being calm in chaos is a skill, but choosing chaos as your permanent environment is not a virtue. I learned that loyalty without reciprocity is just slow self-erasure, dressed up as professionalism. Most of all, I learned that when people tell you who they are through their actions, especially when it costs them nothing to be kind and they choose not to be, you should listen the first time. I still think about that badge reader chirping sometimes, the sharp sound of access revoked, and how final it felt in the moment. But now I understand it wasn't an ending. It was an interruption, a forced pause that made room for a better version of my life to exist. I work fewer hours now. I sleep through the night. I get paid for the value I provide instead of the silence I maintain. And every once in a while, when a client thanks me for flagging a problem early, for building something sustainable instead of flashy, I smile to myself because I know exactly how rare that kind of appreciation can be. This story doesn't end with applause or a dramatic showdown. It ends quietly, with me choosing myself in a way I never had before, and realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after being shown the door is to walk forward without looking back.